Good afternoon. Welcome back for those who were here this morning, and I see a few new faces in the audience. Today we're having a symposium on gun violence in Louisiana, as you know. We've had a wonderful turnout thus far, and we've had some very interesting conversations and discussions about the state of gun violence in Louisiana, some of the root causes of it, and potentially some solutions for the issue as well. I'm Michael Martin. I'm the director of the Center for Louisiana Studies. Just a couple of words of thanks. First off, we want to thank the UL Lafayette Alumni Association for allowing us to use this wonderful facility. We also want to thank AOC Community Media, who are filming and will be later making this available through their website and on their open access channels in Lafayette. And we also want to thank the College of Liberal Arts, not only for their moral support, but also for their financial support as well. We are now ready to enter our first post-lunch session, this one on race and gun violence. By way of announcement, one of our speakers unfortunately had to withdraw. Professor Fred Jones of Louisiana College had a mountain of administrative work that all of a sudden cropped up, and so he had to withdraw. He sends his regrets, and he also sends word that he is certain that the remaining panelists will do wonderfully. Our panelist for this session is Rob Hanser from the University of Louisiana at Monroe, where he is professor of criminal justice. Our moderator is Libra Bias, who is with the Southern University Law Center. I will not take up much of any more of your time. I will hand the panel over to them and allow them to get started.
Okay, I'm right now just experimenting to make sure I have an idea how the mic sounds and everything. My name is Rob Hanser, and the topic, of course, will be, just as it says there, race, crime, and gun violence. Before I go ahead and begin, I did want to explain that a lot of the information, in fact, 85% of it, if you will, is information that is readily available on federal websites. There's going to be some exceptions, maybe like the Pew Research Center and other sources such as that, where I've obtained this data. I do not want to give the idea that I myself have conducted this research and gone out and administered surveys or done anything to that effect. But this is open source data upon which this presentation will be based. And kind of opening up, what I thought I would do in talking about this topic, and I want to explain, this was one of the categories that was listed as part of the agenda for this symposium. There were a couple of them that I felt comfortable speaking on, and this was one of them. But in doing that, I don't always know who my audience will be now, and so I wrote as if there may be a few criminologists out in the amongst the group. And then I wrote as if there would be a few people who are not criminologists who are out in the group. And because of that, I thought that I would go back to the basics real quick and explain some things that any criminologist or any crime analyst, data analyst worth their salt knows. And the first thing that they know about crime in the United States is that it does tend to be intra-racial, not interracial. So what that means is, and this does hold true among different racial ethnic groups as well, Caucasian Americans tend to perpetrate crimes most frequently against other Caucasian Americans. African Americans tend to perpetrate crimes most frequently against other African Americans. Latino Americans tend to perpetrate crimes against other Latino Americans. Obviously, this is not true 100% of the time, but the majority of the time. And this does hold true with other groups as well, such as Asian Americans and Native Americans. So I just like to throw that out there. The unfortunate thing, and I was explaining this to Ms. Bias just a while ago, when you try to break it down much further than that, like say with Asian Americans, when you try to distinguish between, say, Chinese Americans or Indian Americans or, Vietnamese Americans, that breakdown is not very widespread available. So but still, there's anecdotal data or knowledge that we have that shows that still tends to kind of mirror that even at that level. So with that being said, that's basically all this slide is saying, except the one thing that it's pointing out, and I do cite Sarah Becker. Though this is a little older study, there hasn't been much more that has done this particular, has taken this particular tack in doing the research. So that's why I picked this study and showcasing these basics. Is most of the research that we have on intra-racial crime, it's done with national level data. So it takes just all of the UCR Uniform Crime Report data, clumps everybody and everything together across the nation, and takes a state like Louisiana and a state like Idaho and morphs all that data together and runs the analyses, but they don't usually tease out different areas and different regions and different areas where maybe there are more Asian Americans who may congregate, and different areas where there may be more Caucasian Americans, and then different areas where there may be more African Americans that reside in those areas. And Sarah Becker did do this. And basically what she found is that ultimately, a few things, but first off, this myth, and I do like to kind of address some of how perceptions are formed, particularly in today's world of social media and the media and things of this nature. But this idea that, the perpetrating population against the Caucasian population tends to be African American. She showed once again, even at localized levels, this does not happen to be true whatsoever. The intra-racial component still stays intact. The other thing that she showed is that the pattern persists at local level analyses, but that it's the two key variables aside from the cluster of residences that tended to make a difference were the occupational trajectories that were picked by groups, as well as educational access or the educational system. And basically what she's saying there, and she doesn't say it in her abstract and right off the top, but later in her discussion, what she concludes is that many of the minority communities that were analyzed and that were part of this study happen to have an impoverished economy more frequently than the Caucasian economies. And what they found is that things like what types of jobs were in that area and the access to education aggravated these statistics or mitigated them, depending on which group you're talking about. So, as you would guess, the better the occupational access and the better access to education, the less kind of violence or crime you saw at all whatsoever, including, of course, gun violence. So I thought that was interesting to point out as basics, because later on I'm going to show you, and I'll go ahead and spill the beans now, I'm going to show you that actually I don't know if that necessarily is a good causal explanation here in Louisiana or not. If at best it would be correlational, and I'm not so sure about that. I'm going to make sure I didn't skip a slide. Now, just real quickly, the rate of African American homicide victimization in Louisiana is 25.75 per 100,000. Okay? I'm wanting to say this is 2014 data. I failed to put it on there. It's either 2014, 2013. I can't remember, but it's pretty close to right now. As close as you can get to now, as the data will allow, due to lag times in data collection and data analysis. The rate of African American homicide victimization throughout the United States is 18.03 per 100,000. So you can see that in Louisiana, it's a bit higher than it is throughout the rest of the nation. Now, the national overall homicide victim rate for victims of all races, or any race, all of them combined, is only 4.5 per 100,000, and the national Caucasian victim homicide rate was even lower. So for Caucasian Americans, the likelihood of being a victim of homicide is the lowest, 2.65 out of 100,000. And then when you add all races together across the nation, what you get is about 4.5 out of 100,000. Then what you get, if you look at African Americans, on the other hand, throughout the whole nation, they have a rate of 18.03 per 100,000. So it goes up dramatically. And then in Louisiana, it's even higher. So that's the thing That's the key central focus of our discussion today, is the fact that African Americans, the African American community, tends to suffer from victimization from gun homicides more than any other group identified in Louisiana. And I don't mind emailing this also if there's anyone here who wants it, it's, and yes, of course, the pictures are great, but if you want the slide, I'm happy to send it to you as well. Going a little further, number and rate of African American homicide victims by top 10 states. Now, this is from the Violence Policy Center. They're a reputable research organization. I tried to stick only with stuff that I could sink my teeth into and demonstrate that they know what they're doing and that they use good data, and it's not skewed and bipartisan and all that. So with that being said, the thing I think that's interesting, of course, first off, is Louisiana number of homicides and the homicide rate. You can see there's 384. And this would be in 2014. The 2015 publication date has 2014 data. And then the homicide rate per 100,000, 25.75. Now, the thing that I want to go show beyond that, and some of this I'm kind of speculating. I'm going to tell you the honest truth. I'm taking national level aggregate data, and I'm kind of adding an interpretation and analysis to it based on the grand total of the circumstances that I have from different studies, that when you corroborate them all together, and basically what researchers say, when you triangulate your data sources and put them all together, you get a kind of a composite picture. And one of the things I want to make note of is, first off, number 1, 2, 3, and 4, if you notice, those are not southern states. That's key, because that's the general perception in the U.S., is that you're going to have this largely being, identified southern, southeastern states. Now, interestingly, given the stuff that's happened in Ferguson and all, Missouri happens to be first. So I thought I'd just point that out as a little anecdotal note. But the other thing is Missouri, then like Nebraska, Michigan, Pennsylvania, these are not known to be, particularly problematic states, just for whatever that's worth. And then Indiana, Oklahoma, Wisconsin, California. The only other southern state there is Tennessee, and I think that's important because my analysis is going to not only look at Louisiana, but look at states adjacent to Louisiana, because if there's anyone else who's going to be close culturally and socioeconomically to Louisiana, it's going to be those areas in and around Louisiana, and you'll see in just a few moments. But nevertheless, I show that to you to show that what you don't see is, you don't see a bunch of like Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina. And that's a common stereotype with firearms ownership, and also with firearms violence. And this shows that that's not necessarily completely true. Well, Texas, now wait a minute. Let's go back. Now make your statement, because now your statement is correct. I can't believe Texas isn't on there. But see, this table, and I got to be careful as a researcher when I present tables that they don't get misunderstood. Texas is not on there, whether that could be good, bad, or indifferent. Now, I cannot recall if Texas happens to be like number 11 or something. Actually, I do remember. I think they're down in the upper 20s or something. But I can't remember for a fact. I'd have to go and look at the data or the report. But nevertheless, they're not there. But this chart, what I want you to understand, the reason why Texas is on there, not that it matters to me which state is on there, but Texas is on there because if you notice, so is Arkansas and Mississippi, and those three states happen to be the ones that are adjacent to Louisiana. And so what I'm trying to show is not just Louisiana statistics, because if you take Louisiana statistics and that's all you look at and you ignore what's going on just an hour away, that's a false picture, because that border is really artificial. People cross it day in, day out and don't think about it. So to limit your data is kind of like when we say that someone, I don't know, at 20 years old, 364 days, they really can't process alcohol maturely. but all of a sudden at 20 years old, 365 days, in the span of 24 hours, they instantly, poof, become able to maturely handle alcohol. That's an artificial metric, an artificial cutoff line that we came up with legally, but that does not necessarily mean that neurophysiologically the person is much different in that span of 24 hours. So these borders that we have are human-made, but they do not really reflect the reality of what people are doing in their day-to-day lives. Thus, therefore, in presenting this information, I want to make sure to just not talk about Louisiana, but surrounding areas. Now, the problem with Texas is this, is it's so darn big, okay? And so when you're analyzing data in Texas, I think it's fair to say a lot of East Texas kind of mirrors parts of, Louisiana's dynamics, but certainly once you get toward El Paso, I think you've gone into a whole different, cultural milieu, if you will, that's not really similar. So, with some degree of trepidation, I put Texas into this mix, but I would be remiss if I didn't, since it shares the whole western border with the state. So you have to sometimes just do your best with what you have. And that's what I did here. And with that being said, you find some interesting stuff. And I don't know if you can see this number here, but I keep these numbers here on the right in the next few charts. But 25.75 is us in Louisiana. And then what you see is with Mississippi, it's 11.38. Arkansas, 18.05. And then Texas has second lowest, 13.06. Now, the number of homicides, I put that there just for general information, but really what we want to pay attention to is the rate, because we want it to be comparable per 100,000 so we can actually make an accurate comparison. What we can see is between us and our neighbors, we have the worst situation. I mean, it's just plain as day. It's over double the problem that Mississippi has with this. It's I don't know, it's about maybe 40% higher than in Arkansas. And then in Texas, it's getting close to almost, double. It's probably 90%, 88%. So I just throw that out there because I think that it's good to look at the region, not just the state. Taking this further, and I want to make sure that I'm not hitting this wrong. Race of victim by race of offender, and this is something we're going to kind of go back and forth through different analyses. I wanted to show that, as you can see, African American homicides, gun homicides, are 2,245 out of 2,491. That's pretty pronounced, okay? And then the other thing is what I also want to show is, when you look at Caucasian, on Caucasian, you got 2,509 out of 3,005. So it's real clear that each group tends to gravitate when selecting victims towards its own group. But nevertheless, this rate of homicide victimization among African Americans is higher, because this is the thing that I want you to understand. The African American homicide total, gun homicide total of 2,491, is based on about 13 to 14% of our U.S. population, right? The 3,005 homicides, which is, with some degree of hesitance, I say is only 500 more, okay? But that's based on the other probably 50% of the U.S. population for sure, okay? So my point is the rate by which Caucasians are being shot, as we discussed earlier, is much lower. Even though this number is a little higher, it's based on a much larger percentage. And always keep in mind these proportions. Don't let these charts, I like to make sure that they don't get misinterpreted. Now, with that being said, the other thing that I wanted to point out is that Caucasians shooting African Americans in this particular sample from 2013 data, 189, and that's roughly about 7.7%, okay? And then also, with African Americans shooting Caucasians, it goes up to about 16%. While there's a difference there, I do not consider that so dramatic that that's newsworthy myself. I do not consider that a difference that's so significant that, like, you know, if you had, say, 60% in one and 10% in the other. They're within the same tenths of each other, and as far as I'm concerned, that's pretty fair game, you know. So, but the perceptions that one group, cross-racial group, is identifying another group is really not what the norm is and the trend with the data, and that's just important that I again reiterate that. So keeping that in mind. The other thing that I wanted to look at, and we see back again, we're looking at Texas, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And what we're doing is looking at race, income, and education. And you may ask yourself, how come is he asking about race, income, and education? And the reason I'm doing that is because according to Sarah Becker back at the beginning, if you remember, she said that occupation and education may be mitigating or aggravating variables with the total analysis. So, or co-varying variables perhaps. But anyway, the point of the matter is she found them to be potentially significant. So what I decided is this. Now I took this, I went rogue, and I decided to just on my own commandeer this statewide and federal data and put it together in a way that to me made some, at least to my head, logical extension, a sense of logical extension that to me made sense. And what I speculate is, well, of course then, if Sarah Becker is saying that nationally, you know, we see this, and then when we look more locally, we see these trends, and particularly when we look locally and we see that education and occupational access may have something to tie in with this, then we should see this between local and national, maybe like county or parish level, and then state level. And I didn't want to, at the time I thought I only had 20 minutes, so I didn't go into county and parish, you know, but I did do state. And I think this is honestly, when I look at it, confusing. That's what I concluded. I was hoping to have some conclusive trend. Now, it wouldn't be conclusive because this isn't testing for significance and all that. But what you see in Louisiana, the first thing, and this is the first thing that I wondered if maybe in Louisiana the reason it's so high is because Louisiana has a higher representation of African Americans proportionally. That kind of stands to reason then that your rate may be a bit higher in states, you know. Obviously, if it's, say, South Dakota, where maybe it's 2% African American, you're not going to see that rate likely be as high necessarily. But then where you have Native Americans, you know, that are much more represented, you may see more of this homicide problem, you know, amongst their own group. Now, you know, someone may say, well, just because it's 2%, you could still have the same problems rate-wise per 100,000. But I would say to you that they've shown in the data that the more hundreds of thousands that you get an almost like synergistic effect, if you will, or an additive, cumulative effect. So usually when you analyze these numbers, you know, 2% per capita won't show up usually as much as, say, if you have 32.5 or 37.5%. But nevertheless, going with that, Louisiana has 32.5% African American population, you know, and, you know, the rate that we have here with a homicide rate per 100,000 is 25.75, and I use the per capita income rather than household because I have no idea exactly how many people are in each household, and I have no idea in those households if we have biracial, if we have multicultural families, or, you know, solely African American, solely Caucasian, solely Asian. I just went with per capita because I felt like that was a better measure across all the states. 24,442 per year, and actually, you know, having a bachelor's degree or higher, 21.8%. So, what that would mean is Mississippi having 37.5% maybe should have a higher rate. And if you don't think that, that's okay. But Mississippi, they make less money per capita per year. And they actually have fewer, just a tad, just a hair, fewer bachelor's degrees. So if we're going to see Mississippi go in one direction or the other, what we should see is Mississippi having a higher rate of gun violence against African Americans, true? If Sarah Becker's ideas are true, but we don't. Mississippi has 5% more African American proportionally representation, makes less money, has just a few less bachelor's degrees, and the rate is less than half. Then when you look at Arkansas, Arkansas has a lower proportion of African Americans, but they do make less, oddly enough, per capita. And then also their bachelor's degree attainment is just a little off. And yes, I did triple check. Those numbers are identical for Arkansas and for Mississippi. Their rate is higher than Mississippi, which doesn't make sense because they have proportionally fewer African Americans, and it also doesn't make sense because they make less than we do, and they have just a tad fewer bachelor's degrees, but yet their rate is under our 25.75. So I start to question if any of these variables really hold true as very effective predictor variables. I'm just not sure. And then in Texas, which is kind of the odd duck as a comparison because, again, it's so large and, the population, on one half of the state doesn't necessarily mirror the population on the eastern half. 12.5% representation. They do make more per capita and do have higher bachelor's degrees, or, higher attainment of bachelor's degrees. And, of course, their homicide rate per 100,000 is lower. But the thing I would submit to you is it is higher than Mississippi's. When Mississippi has more representation, lower money, and fewer bachelors, and the fewer bachelors is a little more significant in this case. So none of this between these four states, you see a contradiction every which way you go. There is no trend here. That's my whole point. I can't find it, at least with the federal government data that I have. So I wanted to showcase that and completely muddy the water. Because that honestly is what's out there, in the federal data. Now, the other thing I wanted to see was gun ownership and the population, and then also approximate guns owned in the state. Now, this approximate guns owned in the state is not very good information that I would focus on. It's an approximation that a group used based on something called the Small Arms Survey, which is an international group that does a lot of research on, small arms and throughout different countries. But I just put it in there for kicks. I wouldn't necessarily consider it completely valid because they did a lot of imputing and they did a lot of extrapolating. If, overall they say this many handguns are owned, or this many small arms, it's not just handguns, but guns are owned in the U.S., then each state based on population probably has this many. But that's not really true because some states have disproportionate amounts more than other states. But the rest of this data is federal data, CDC, Centers for Disease Control. And what you see here is Louisiana has about 44% gun ownership, roughly speaking. Now, what I wanted to look at is something that a lot of times isn't always talked about among criminologists. Rather, instead, it's talked about among public safety experts and other people such as that, medical personnel. This gun injury deaths per 100,000. And these are accidents, largely speaking. And in Louisiana, the rate is 19.3, Now, gun ownership in Mississippi is higher than in Louisiana by 11%, but their rate of having gun injury deaths is 17.8, a little lower. Then Arkansas has a higher rate of gun ownership, and oddly enough, to further muddy the water, they have an even lower rate of gun injury deaths than Mississippi and Louisiana. So the idea of owning more guns equals having more injuries really doesn't seem to pan out in our region, at least from what I can tell. In Texas, that's the lowest amount of gun ownership, but it's still considered high nationally speaking. It's about 36%. But it has, a gun injury death rate, of per 100,000 of 10.6. Now, I went ahead and compared that with carried over the homicide rate, as well. But I wanted to look at the injury deaths per 100,000 as well to demonstrate that and this will be my conclusion at the end, that there's something going on in Louisiana looking at this where one would have to say maybe we're just not very safe in general. And that's not an amazing revelation if you look at auto insurance rates, you look at child mortality rates, violence against women rates, crime rates, prison rates. What I just said, I should be able to say with a surety and not have to feel like I need to crawfish back one bit whatsoever. Again, you got to look at the whole picture, not just myopically look at gun injury deaths alone in a vacuum, but consider it in the context, and that's why we're looking at other states around us as well. So, now, I do not expect to be able to read all of this, but basically, and you guys read all this, but basically what this is showing is, typically speaking, and I'm going to summarize very briefly. Again, if you want the slides and you want to go to the sources, and I have the references at the end, you can go check this out yourself. But basically what they're saying is, when we're able to know what the relationship was between the victim and the perpetrator, what we find is that they tend to know each other most of the time, and they also, in half the time, if you take these stats and you know, when it says 77% of the 60%, I calculated all that out and found that right at about half, it was like 49.1% of them, not only knew each other, but had some kind of verbal altercation prior to getting shot. So what we conclude is that at least in half the incidences that we've seen, these people know each other and know each other well enough to have verbal altercations with one another. Probably not just one, probably something that is built up over time. There probably aren't a whole lot of situations where two people get together, they have a spat for about 5 minutes with each other, and they pull out guns. That's probably not what's going on. What's probably going on is this stuff's built up to this point in half the cases. That tells us a lot with gun violence prevention, doesn't it? Tells us where to, not for one thing, not to focus so much on stranger victimization. And so anyway, that's basically what all this is saying. It says a little more than that, of course, but at the end of the day, that's the biggest finding there. Violent crime in the United States, just so you know, basically what this is showing, and I'm not going to go over every bit of it, that violent crimes decreased by 4.4% in 2013 from 2012. Violent crime has been going down. It's been a trend for about almost 10 years, roughly speaking. It's lower than it was in 2009 and 2004. It's going down slowly but surely. Now, this is not at all what you would think if you watch the news. Certainly if you watch the online news, because, I mean, everything's, shootings, sexual assaults and stuff, and of course that stuff's happening, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to dismiss it or discount it, but it leaves this impression that the criminals are taking over. There's no safe place anymore and things of this nature, and that's really not true. That's not what's going on, okay? And so that's basically what that's saying. And then types of weapons used in violent crime showed that firearms were used in 69% of murders, and this is not amazing. Now, just so you know, the vast majority, I'm sticking my neck out here, when I say close to 90%, actually it's probably a little more, but close to 90% of any gun used in murders tends to be handguns. Just so you know. I mean, read that as you want, doesn't bother me. And incidentally, I'm not anti-gun or pro-gun. I have no dog in this hunt whatsoever. But that's just what the stats show. So perceptions of public related to gun violence, and what they found is, and these researchers here, despite the attention to gun violence in recent months, most Americans are unaware that gun crime is markedly lower than it was 2 decades ago. A Pew Research Center survey found that 56% of Americans believe that the number of crimes involving a gun is higher than it was 20 years ago. Only 12% said it was lower, and 26% said it's about the same. So this shows you that people really do kind of think, well, things are worse than they've ever been before. And in fact, they're going down every year consistently. So I think the one key thing, because if you understand victim surveys And if you understand citizen perception surveys and community surveys, and I've done several of those, but if you understand that data, that's very important, because if the news was saying crime has gone down 10 years in a row, likelihood of being a victim of homicide goes down 10th year in a row, people's perceptions would be different. They would feel more empowered. And what you find is, even if it's kind of pseudo-surreal, the fact that they feel that they have some control over what goes on in their community actually does tend to empower citizen groups to do other things, like engage more in citizen patrols, engage more in keeping an eye out on their neighbor, things of this nature. You would think the other way, if crime goes up, they want to do it more, but actually what they find is if you give them empowering messages in the media, they tend to engage in it all the more, because they see that there's some efficacy behind their efforts. So I'm just saying that if the news were making headlines saying gun crime down 10th year in a row, we might see some positive stuff come out of that possibly. Ownership of firearm related to gun violence. There's also a debate about the extent of gun ownership in the U.S., and there is, some evidence of a link between firearm ownership and firearm homicide at the local level. It's difficult to determine the causal direction. This is very important. There are some researchers, in fact, there's quite a few, who say that really firearm violence elevates rates of gun ownership, not the reverse. In other words, owning the guns isn't what's causing the violence. Rather, instead, what's going on, they're saying, is when you really, really look at it carefully and tease out the data, what you find is gun violence incidents happen in certain communities, and then people are rushing out and buying guns to defend themselves. So what they're saying is, every time you're looking at the gun ownership anyway, just like Hanser showed you with the 4 states, and you're looking at that saying, well, is there a correlation there between a rate of gun ownership and rate of gun violence? They're saying even if you do find some kind of correlation, what you're more than likely finding is the gun violence happened first, and then people are going out and buying more guns. I'm not sure which one is true. Obviously, no one here knows either, but it's a possibility, and it makes it more muddy. This is a little map from the Pew Research Center that shows rates of gun violence ownership. And as you can see, the South is 38%, but the Midwest is 35%, and the West is 34%. I don't know about you guys. While I guess an extra 3%, is something that, you can make note of a bit, it is 3%. It's not something that I find amazing. I would not hang my hat on 3% findings myself. And I doubt seriously, but I can't crunch these numbers to test for significance, but I doubt seriously there's much significance between 34% and 38%, or 35% and 38%. Now, just so you know, what they did note about the South is this. Well, before I say that, let me show you. First off, those who have gun, rifle, or pistol by race, ethnicity, now this is national data, and what you tend to see is that Caucasians report, this is self-report too, report 41% gun ownership. African Americans report 19% gun ownership, and Latino Americans 20%. Now, what I will say to you is a couple things about the southern region. What they say is, what they speculate, they don't really speculate, they know in the data. There's more Caucasians who own guns in the South. In fact, there's probably closer to 48, 49%, maybe even 50%. And then there's, among the African American population in the South, it's lower. It's about like 22, 23%. And when you average it out, going back all together, and keep in mind also, African Americans are most represented. If you had to pick any area of the U.S., it's which one? The South. Okay? So you're going to see a better blend of Caucasian and African American numbers being closer in numerical numbers to each other than you will in many of these other areas. When you average it out, you get 38%. That's where that's coming from. So you do have more Caucasians in the South owning firearms. Just for whatever that's worth, it's something for you to understand. However, what that tells you also is two things. This is self-reported information. And if we have higher rates of homicide victimization among the African American community, i.e. these are criminal events, then these are probably disproportionate numbers of criminals who are doing these victimizations in the African American community, and they probably are not on this survey reporting that they own firearms. So the rate of African American firearm ownership in the South may actually be quite a bit higher, but hidden. Now, that's not to say also there's many Caucasian Americans who own guns and they forget how many they own. They've got one in the closet, one tucked away under the bed, and you know, all this. So I don't know. This is what we know from what people say they have. That's all. There's a dark figure out there of unknown data. Okay, Pew Research Center, they found this. Those with a gun at home differ little from other Americans, regardless of racial ethnic category. They tend to differ very little from all the rest of the Americans who don't own guns, contrary to popular stereotype. For example, they are as focused on health and fitness as those in non-gun-owning households, and they're about equally likely to say they think of themselves as compassionate or trusting people. There is one area, there were two areas, I can't remember one, but the other one, I thought I would, but I can't. But the other one that I do remember, and they were both similar to something like this, where they do differ is when they are asked, I am proud to be an American, more of them say yes. That's the biggest kind of difference they found. A bit more patriotic. And I can't remember the other one, but it's something along those lines. So I'm not sure. I mean, I guess being more patriotic is a good thing. I don't know. I don't know if it's 6 of one, half a dozen of another. But that's the only kind of difference they really could find in their survey research. So take that as you will. Last note, oddly, African Americans are more likely to be victims of firearm homicides, but yet are only half as likely as Caucasians to have a gun in the home, from what is reported. Now, Latinos are less likely to be gun homicide victims, but also are half as likely as Caucasians to have a gun in the home. So Latinos have half the ownership, but also have a less likelihood of being victimized. So all three groups, you see differences. That's, you know, but nevertheless, when you do have Latino Americans victimized by gun homicide, they tend to be at the hands of another Latino American, for whatever that's worth. Concluding comments, I have no idea how long I've gone, but I figured with the kind of time we have, I didn't have to really... Okay. All right. Right on time, which one? The actual time or the time with...
Actual time.
Oh,
so
really?
that we can open the floor for questions.
Okay, so I'm just now going into the enhanced time availability. Is that right?
Well, actually, it's a quarter till, so I think right after you
Doing
finish
good.
making these points, then we can open the floor for questions.
Excellent. Well, that's great. I'm almost done. I just wanted to make sure that, you know, I mean, if you don't ask, you don't know, and so I thought I'd ask. And incidentally, I'm very laid back. In fact, you know, with most presentations, I just kind of like to get up there and just talk back and forth and stuff. You know, it's probably not the best form, but you know, I don't know. I like kind of, you know, I'm pretty informal. So, but I'll get back on the topic, Rob. So, concluding comments. According to the National Safety Council, throughout the nation, there is a fairly low likelihood of dying from a firearms assault. 1 in 356 likelihood, or from a firearms discharge. 1 in 6,509, you know, out of 6, you would be 1 out of 6,509 people. So, my point is, or every 1 out of every 6,509 people, my point is this is not something, nationally speaking, that truly, I don't know. I mean, you would have to look at other death rates in that CDC data where I got this, but I don't think you walk away thinking that this is the #1 killer, just for whatever that's worth. Now, is it something serious? Obviously, it's something serious. Is it something preventable? Yes. That's why we should take it serious, if nothing else, because if you can just get control on the guns, you don't have these deaths at all. So, unlike many of the other causes of death the CDC lists where we can't do anything about it, this is something we can and should. So that's why I think it's really the big deal. African Americans have a higher than average likelihood of being a gun homicide victim, and we have to explore what may be going on there. Because really, I do not want to come to you today and say, hey, guess what? It's all murky. don't got a clue what's really correlating for a fact with this stuff and what's not. I would rather come to you and be able to say, well, it's this variable, and that variable, and now we know what to do to fix it. But really, when you look at the data from government sources, you get some contradictory stuff, and I think that's important to note. But nevertheless, that needs to be examined in order to create effective prevention programs and to empower communities to be able to address this. This victimization tends to be at the hands of an African-American perpetrator. It's fairly inconclusive as to why. It's fairly inconclusive as to how to address. With that being said, what I came up with was this. Because it does not appear that gun ownership is related to the rate of homicides or to gun violence per se, recommendations should be designed to surgically address problem areas without also negatively impacting potential buffers to crime. Now, that's me being very tactful. What I'm really saying in plain language is we need to figure out where the real problem is, not what the newspaper says, not what YouTube says, not what, the social media says. We need to really find out where the real problem is, and we need to custom tailor not just our policies, but the actual actions. I can write all kinds of nifty policy manuals that I want, and I have. But if nobody's really, in fact, doing the policies the way they're written, then there's something wrong with the policy or something wrong with the people doing it. One or the other. Because presuming everyone understands the policy and everyone understands the guidelines, then there should be, effectiveness in outcomes. So my point is if we surgically not just enhance laws or stuff of this nature, but actually reach into communities, just like I talked about with victim satisfaction surveys, victim fear of crime surveys, things like this, if we reach into those communities and empower those communities from within, that may be where we can better affect this. So that way, for example, the African American community may have a lot of great ideas on exactly how to ameliorate this problem within, as well as, of course, doing stuff external, but I think that's the best first step. So with that being said, the only other thing I added to that was gun safety education for all, including, of course, the African American community, but for everyone. Because again, we go back to the data I showed you, Louisiana obviously just is not safe as other states with firearms. I do not know why that is. I have no clue, but what I do know is it never hurts to train people a little more and a little more thoroughly on safety. How could that be a problem? Then the last thing, continue programs to reduce illicit gun possession ownership. Regardless, that doesn't mean so we quit enforcing the law. We still need to be vigorous in finding illegal firearms and getting them out of the community, and all those policies and stuff and all those law enforcement programs we have to do so need to stay intact. But what we probably need to do in today's tight fiscal era, budgetary constraints as they are, is find out which ones really are working for a fact and which ones kind of aren't, and focus more on areas that surgically are working to reduce victimization. Not necessarily to get the biggest, best busts and promotions, but the ones that actually reduce victimization. That should be the overall overarching goal and objective. That is my presentation, and there's the references.
Thank you, Dr. Hanser. I think we have about maybe 5 minutes to open the floor for questions. One of the things I wanted to mention, and the most alarming fact that you showed us, was that Louisiana, having a significantly lower population than Texas, has a much higher rate of homicide. And I was just wondering how much cultural diversity plays a part in that, as well as the availability of state resources and the access that minorities may have to them.
I think that's actually a very, very good question, and I do think it's actually pertinent to that particular example. You know, when we talk about diversity, there's numerous which ways that we can talk about diversity. And, kind of talking about that part first. Louisiana is a diverse state, however, there are two groups that tend to be the most predominant, and that is African American and Caucasian American. While, of course, you have Latino Americans and you have Asian Americans and Native Americans in Louisiana, when you look at rates of Latino Americans, Asian Americans, and Native Americans in Texas, it's very clear that those populations are much more represented in Texas, particularly the Latino American population as compared to in Louisiana. And as we saw in the data, Latino Americans tend to own firearms less frequently than Caucasians, and they also tend to have lower rates of violent or of gun victimization. So I think when you take these other groups and you have more representation throughout the state and in that larger pool, population, state population, I think that those numbers tend to kind of average out or flatten out the rates. So that's part of the reason I think you see the difference between Texas and Louisiana, as far as the diversity, issue. And I think that that's important because what that means is our situation is kind of similar, but kind of not. And what we may need to focus on may need to be, again, more surgical, specifically tailored if we're going to be culturally competent in our interventions, specifically tailored for African American communities. So that would be that point, and I can't remember.
The other question was, does access to or the availability of state resources to minority populations have an impact as well?
Yes, and I think that that's overwhelmingly clear. While states across the nation are somewhat hamstrung by today's economic conditions, you can tell that some states are impacted worse than others. Now that's not to say that Texas is impervious to the economic climate. In fact, the oil industry has kind of, not done so well for people who are used to getting oil revenue, and so Texas has been affected by that. However, the other thing is with Texas is you see more industrial areas that also have high technology development and a diverse array of types of business industries and things of this nature. And so I think that Texas, because of the size, volume, and numerous, you have like the Dallas, the Austin, the Houston, Corpus Christi, you have a lot of larger cities that have both the maritime like Louisiana as well as the oil industry, but a lot of technology and, other areas. And so I think when you add all that together, Texas has been fortunate to be able to buffer itself somewhat, from some of the effects. So there are more monies available. I'd all but bet on it that there's, per capita more money available for the minority populations there.
Okay. Any more questions? I think we have about 2 minutes or so. Yes.
Yeah, I'm surprised to hear you called for, surgical responses to poor and minority communities, which I'm not sure what exactly you mean. It sounds like something that's different than the laws that affect all of us all at one time. And so if I said to you that I think that the laws that are in place are that adversely affect the poor and minority communities and help or benefit wider and wealthier communities, what would you say to that?
Well, first off, I'm very familiar with structural criminologists and that kind of orientation as far as the fact that crime and economics as well as crime enforcement and economics tend to have some covariance. Certainly individuals that have lots of political and lots of economic clout can have quite a significant impact on how we formulate our laws and policies. That's undeniable, even in this capitalist democratic nation as we have it. That's very common knowledge. And in fact, also, on the flip side, communities that are not as advantaged tend to have less input, So that part, is just part of the mix. But what I would say to you is that's exactly what I was trying to not do, is focus on the laws, because that's exactly what I don't know if the laws are really great as they are or if they're not that great. I don't really know. That's not really what my focus is. Regardless of what the laws are, that doesn't mean they're being enforced equally. And I think that matters. It doesn't mean just because it's on law, on a piece of paper in Baton Rouge, that's what's going on everywhere throughout Louisiana. The other thing I would also say, just kind of throwing stuff out there as far as laws and all go. What legally it says and then what's pled in court later are two different animals at the end. So, you know, as far as the laws, I mean, yeah, maybe they could be better crafted, or in this case, maybe, you know, they probably do result in some disparity. I don't doubt that one bit. But what I would say, if you're really trying to fix the problem, not just have yet another pretty piece of paper that this is going to fix the problem, but it never does, which is what we've been doing for decades, coming up with niftier pieces of paper that supposedly are going to fix the problem, but yet we keep having federal funding for grant-based programs to eliminate the problem 20 years later. Instead, what I would say is, yeah, sure, do the laws, but also go into the community and see if the community, it's kind of like with domestic violence. Many members in that community know who those gun owners are, but they're not saying. But they might go and talk to the gun owner if the person owns the gun and is kind of dangerous and say something to them. You see what I'm saying? Community policing teaches us if you befriend the community, they are more likely to work with you to prevent crimes that as a police officer patrolling the community, you never even knew were going on because you never see it. As soon as your squad car comes, they quit doing it. They go somewhere else and do it, but they're not going to tell you. So that's what I think. I think that the law part is good, but I think that that's just a thin veneer disguise in addressing the problem. I think the problem is deeper than that in the human interactions that actually do take place day to day.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question and then we'll move on to our film presentation. Yes.
I'm sorry. Okay, so my question, you made a comment of the surgical interaction when it comes to race, gun violence. So are there some surgical processes that have been practiced anywhere that you're aware of, or that you would recommend as a criminologist you might share with us?
I would. There's only one that I'm really going to throw out there. For one, because of the brevity that's necessary, and then for two, because it's really, I think, the best option. And you know, I've trained at police academy, cadet level, and stuff of this nature. And what I wound up getting one time, and it stuck with me for over 10 years, was I got the community policing part, you know, and they called it something else, but it's really community policing. And you know, when I was kind of new at it, you know, I mean, it's not the most popular part of training cadets, you know. I mean, it's not that they don't like it per se, but you know, they're wanting to know about the laws, they're wanting to know about the, you know, the defensive tactics, you know, the firearms, the driving fast in the squad car, all, you know, all the exciting stuff. But this community policing stuff, you know, a lot of times people think, well, hey, that's common sense, everyone knows it, but they don't. Because we keep having incidents across the nation that show we don't. We can never get too much of that. And basically what community policing does say, and I'm butchering it up the way I'm saying it, but basically it has the police become part of the community. It identifies those that live in a certain area and tries to keep them as much as is feasible in that area, because they'll know the citizens and they'll have a rapport with them. And it encourages police officers to become involved in volunteer organizations and to get to know people, because what they find is once people think that they can, you know, and they should, but this should be true, they shouldn't just think it, but once they realize they can talk with you and say, you know, I have something that really bugs me and I'm not really sure what to do with it, but, you know, do you have any ideas? What they find is sometimes you ferret out more crime. Sometimes they may not tell you, but what you find is crime starts to go down in that community anyway, because they informally talk to their family member, their friend, or a person who they don't like, you know, but they get someone else to fix it. And what you see is as there's a better rapport with the police, the crime rates tend to go down, and victims tend to have less fear of crime in the future. So I think gun violence is no different than any other crime in that regard. If you're really wanting to reduce it, have community policing, trained officers develop that rapport, and then, of course, explain to the community, you know, this issue with firearms is really eating us up, and we need to see what we can do to eliminate this, to keep our kids from having to grow up in this environment in the future. If that comes from someone who happens to be a police officer, but happens to also be someone who you meet for Little League, it goes over a little different than just some guy in a uniform with shades on and a hat who comes up and tells you officially. And that's kind of the best I have for the time we have. I hope that kind of helped.
Okay, well, that concludes session 3, and I think now we'll move to a film presentation.
We have a couple of things going on concurrently. One, there's a premiere of the film 91% across the way in the main house. It is the rough cut of it. It was just edited down last week, is my understanding. So if you're interested in viewing that film, it's available over there. It's a very informal setting. You're welcome to go watch for a little while and then wander back or however you want to do it. We'll also begin beginning our next session in about 15 minutes. And that one will be focusing on the historical and public health context of gun violence in Louisiana.